My name is Daniel Carr. I am 38 years old. And the morning my brother introduced me to his boss as a cautionary tale, I was wearing a jacket that cost more than his monthly salary. He didn't know that. He had spent the better part of 3 years assuming I was failing, and I had spent the better part of 3 years letting him. It started with one sentence, spoken across a crowded company lobby while I stood near the elevators with a paper coffee cup in my hand. "That's my brother," Marcus said, gesturing in my direction the way people point at weather damage or a car they used to own. He bounced around for a while, never really landed anywhere. You know how it is with some people. His boss, a compact man in his early 60s with silver hair and a handshake that could bend rebar, turned toward me slowly. His expression didn't shift. His eyes did. Then he said 2 words that drained every trace of color from my brother's face. "Mr. Carr." Not Danny, not Daniel, not the brother Marcus warned you about. Mr. Carr. With a slight forward lean, the kind of lean that comes from decades of knowing exactly who is worth your posture. Marcus went still. His mouth opened, but the sound that came out was nothing, just breath with no destination. Before I tell you what happened after that, and what it meant for everything my brother had been building on top of my silence, I want to ask you something. What time is it where you're watching from? Because where I'm sitting right now, it's the kind of quiet evening where the truth finally feels comfortable enough to come out. Stay with me. This goes deeper than one lobby. My brother Marcus is 3 years older than me, which in our family meant he got 3 extra years of our father's attention before I arrived to divide it. That math is too simple, I know. Most families don't keep score that cleanly. But ours did. My father, Raymond Carr, believed in the visible record. Trophies on the shelf. Grades posted on the refrigerator. Grades, not the work behind them. Results, not the effort. And Marcus had always been better at producing results that could be framed and hung. He was the athlete, the student council president, the kid who shook hands with adults and made them say things like, "Raymond, you raised that one right." I was quieter. I read too much. I asked too many questions during conversations that were supposed to be agreeable. I had the kind of brain that got me labeled difficult in spaces where difficult meant inconvenient. We were not close growing up. We were not enemies either. We were brothers in the way that 2 people in the same house can share meals and bedrooms and holidays and never really occupy the same world. The closest thing we had to a shared language was competition, which neither of us chose but both of us inherited. My father made it inevitable by the way he distributed praise. Not equally, not consciously, just in proportion to what he valued, and what he valued was legibility. Things he could point to. Things that required no explanation in a conversation with a neighbor or a colleague or a distant uncle at a holiday gathering. Marcus was legible. I was not. I remember a specific evening when I was 12 and Marcus was 15. He had just been named starting quarterback for the junior varsity team, which was the kind of thing my father called his mother to tell her before he called anyone else. There was a dinner, not a restaurant dinner, just a better dinner than usual, with the good plates and the tablecloth that only came out for things that mattered. My father sat at the head of the table and talked about how Marcus had earned his position through discipline and drive, and the willingness to put in the work that other kids weren't willing to do. I remember sitting there with my hands in my lap, thinking about a project I was in the middle of at school. I had built a small-scale water filtration model that my science teacher called genuinely impressive and that I had spent 11 evenings on in a row, staying up past my bedtime with a flashlight because the idea wouldn't let me sleep. Nobody had mentioned it at dinner. Nobody had mentioned it anywhere. It wasn't on the refrigerator. There was no better dinner for it. I didn't say anything that night. I wasn't old enough to name what I was observing, only to feel its shape. But I filed it. That's what I did back then. I filed things, patterns, inconsistencies, the gap between what was celebrated and what was quietly accomplished without anyone watching. I had a drawer full of filed things by the time I left that house, and somewhere in that drawer was the beginning of every decision I ever made about who I was going to tell my life to and when. After high school, Marcus did everything in the right order. State university, business degree, sales job, marriage, house in a good school district, 2 cars in the driveway, and a LinkedIn profile that scrolled like a highlight reel. He called my parents every Sunday. He remembered birthdays. He coached Little League for 3 seasons, even though his son didn't particularly enjoy baseball. Every step was announced and applauded, which was not a criticism of the steps. The steps were real. The announcing was just the part that felt necessary to him in a way it never felt necessary to me. I did things differently. I took 6 months off after community college and drove alone from Ohio to the Pacific Northwest without a plan. I worked in a commercial kitchen in Portland, then helped a friend build a software tool for small restaurant owners, then noticed the tool had a problem nobody else had solved cleanly, then spent 14 months solving it. The product was called Table Lane. It was a reservation and floor management system that didn't require restaurants to replace their existing setup. The kitchen job was the part people would have understood if they'd known about it, but it was also the least important part. What mattered was the 6 months I spent watching restaurant owners lose customers, not because the food was bad or the service was wrong, but because the machinery underneath the operation was broken, and nobody had built anything simple enough to fix it without requiring a consultant, a new computer system, and 3 weeks of retraining. I saw a woman named Gloria run a dinner service almost entirely from memory because her reservation software had crashed, and the backup was on a system no one in the kitchen knew how to restart. She served 42 covers that night through pure retained knowledge, and when I asked her afterward how she'd done it, she said, "The same way I do it when the software is working. The software is mostly in the way." That sentence stayed with me for years. Table Lane began as a document, not even code, just a document describing what a tool would need to do to actually help someone like Gloria without requiring Gloria to learn anything that didn't look like managing a restaurant. I showed it to 3 restaurant owners in Portland. One of them gave me $2,000 and said to come back when it was real. I came back 8 months later with a working version and spent the next 3 years fixing everything I'd assumed wrong. That part of my life happened quietly. I didn't post updates. I didn't attend my 10-year reunion. I stopped going home for Thanksgiving after the 3rd year in a row where Marcus spent dinner explaining the economy to me like I was a student in a class he was barely qualified to teach. He had genuine expertise in regional distribution, which was the industry he worked in, and he was applying that expertise freely and generously to my life, which was not the same thing at all. I found I had very little patience for being advised by someone who hadn't asked what I was working on first. My mother would call afterward and say he didn't mean anything by it. My father would say Marcus just liked to talk. I would say yes, I know. Then I would hang up and go back to building something they didn't know existed. By the time I was 34, Table Lane had contracts with over 2,000 restaurants across 11 states. We had 41 employees. We had turned down 2 acquisition offers that I'm not at liberty to describe in detail, except to say that each one would have changed the trajectory of everyone who worked for me, and not in the direction I wanted. The 3rd offer came from Hollowell Hospitality Group, one of the largest full-service hospitality management companies in the country. That conversation was still ongoing when Marcus called me on a Tuesday in February and said he'd heard from Mom that I was still doing the tech stuff, and asked whether I needed any help connecting with some people he knew in the business world. I told him I was fine. He said he just wanted to make sure I wasn't struggling because he'd noticed I hadn't been home in a while, and sometimes that meant a person was going through something they didn't want to talk about. I thanked him. He said he was serious because his company had some administrative openings and he could probably put in a good word if I was ever looking for something stable. I told him I appreciated it. He said, "Danny, there's no shame in needing a hand. We're family." I said I knew. He said he'd asked around, and one of his colleagues had mentioned seeing me at a diner near the warehouse district, and that I'd looked tired. I thought about explaining everything. I pictured the words assembling themselves: the company, the contracts, the employees, the offers, the quiet mornings in my apartment 3 blocks from that diner where I sometimes went for coffee when I needed to think without anyone needing anything from me. Then I decided not to. Not out of pride. Not out of strategy. I just didn't have the energy to watch Marcus reorganize the information until I fit into a story that didn't threaten the one he was already telling about himself. So I said I was fine, and I let him believe whatever he needed to. That, it turns out, was a more expensive decision than I understood at the time. What I didn't know was that Marcus had been telling people about me, not in a worried brother kind of way, in a comparison kind of way. I found this out from our cousin Reggie, who called me that March and laughed in a tone that was half amused and half horrified. He said Marcus had told his entire friend group, which included several people from his company, that his younger brother had kind of fallen off the map and was probably between things, and that it was one of those situations where the person never quite figured out their direction. Reggie had been at a birthday party for Marcus's wife, and had heard this explanation offered with the casual authority of someone describing a potted plant that had dried out and couldn't be revived. He said a man named Phil, who he described as Marcus's closest work friend, had said that's rough man in the tone people use when they want credit for empathy without spending any real attention on it. What unsettled me was not that Marcus said it. I had expected him to say things like it in some form to someone. What unsettled me was the detail. The confidence. The way Reggie described it, Marcus had not said he didn't know what his brother was up to or that they'd lost touch. He had said he knew. He had offered a specific, settled explanation, complete with emotional weather and a clear narrative arc. The brother who couldn't land anywhere. The brother who might need a hand eventually. The brother you loved but worried about. He had made not knowing into something that looked exactly like knowing. Reggie asked if I had corrected him. I said I hadn't had the chance. Reggie said he hadn't corrected him either because he assumed I already knew and had chosen silence. Then he said, "Have you chosen silence, Daniel?" I said something close to yes. Reggie said he thought that was probably going to get interesting. He was right. It did. The Hollowell Hospitality Group's headquarters were in Columbus, Ohio, which is 40 minutes from the suburb where Marcus and I grew up. I had visited their offices 3 times during the negotiation phase. Each visit required me to fly in from Seattle, which I was doing more than I cared to admit that spring. Marcus worked for a regional supplier that serviced mid-size hotel chains. His office building was in the same city, a glass box near the convention center that had been renovated into something that looked modern from the outside and felt like carpeted urgency from the inside. I didn't know Marcus's office was in that building. I found out when I walked through the lobby on a Thursday morning in April, heading toward a pre-close meeting with Garrett Hollowell, the CEO of Hollowell Hospitality, and his senior acquisitions team. The meeting was on the 14th floor. I had arrived 15 minutes early because that was my habit, and because the building's coffee kiosk was unusually good. I was standing near the elevators with my cup, reviewing notes on my phone, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Danny. I turned. Marcus was crossing the lobby in a gray suit, tie slightly loose, carrying a messenger bag over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw me, his expression moving through several different calculations. Surprise first, then confusion, then a particular kind of recalibration that happens when someone you've filed away in a certain location unexpectedly appears in a different one. "What are you doing here?" he said. "Meeting," I said. He looked at the paper cup in my hand, then at my jacket, then at my face. "Meeting for what?" "A business." He laughed, not meanly, just reflexively, the way people laugh when they're trying to rearrange information that doesn't fit the shelf they built for it. "Here, in this building." 14th floor. He tilted his head. "My company is on the 7th. I nodded. He stepped closer, his voice dropping into the register he used when he was being helpful. "Are you looking at a job here? Because I could probably reach out to someone. I know a few people on HR side. They're usually not posting externally until they've already got someone in mind, but if I mention your name." "I'm not looking at a job." "Then what kind of?" He stopped. The elevator had opened. Garrett Hollowell stepped out. I recognized Garrett immediately. We had spent close to 14 hours across 3 meetings discussing the structure of the deal, the future of the product, the autonomy my team would retain, and a dozen other details that required the kind of trust that only develops over time and shared discomfort. He was the kind of executive who made you feel like the most important conversation he was having was the one happening right now, which sounds like a leadership cliché until you experience it and realize it's actually just a rare form of attentiveness. In 5 months of conversation, he had never once checked his phone while I was speaking. He came off the elevator and scanned the lobby with the efficient peripheral vision of a man who spent his days moving between rooms full of people who needed something from him. His eyes found me and settled. He walked directly across the lobby floor without hesitating. Marcus was still standing beside me. Garrett extended his hand and said, "Mr. Carr, you're early. Good sign." I shook it. Traffic was lighter than I expected. Always is when there's somewhere to be. He smiled. Then he noticed Marcus standing at my left shoulder. Marcus noticed him noticing. This was the moment. The lobby was not crowded, but it was not empty either. A woman at the reception desk had glanced up from her monitor. A man with a badge near the security station had shifted his weight toward us slightly, the involuntary lean of someone who recognizes the presence of someone important and recalibrates accordingly. The acoustics of the room were the kind that carry voices without amplifying them, which means everything said next was heard clearly by everyone present and by no one who could pretend not to have heard. Marcus said, "You know my brother." Garrett looked at him with the measured attention he gave everyone, then at me. Then back at Marcus. "Your brother," Garrett repeated. He said it as a quiet confirmation, not a question. "Yes, we've been in conversation for several months." Marcus straightened slightly. The messenger bag shifted on his shoulder. His voice took on the relaxed authority he used when he was establishing himself in a room where he knew some of the people but not all of them, the voice that was slightly louder than necessary and slightly more certain than the situation required. "I didn't know Danny was connected to Hollowell," he said. "He doesn't really talk about work much. I've been a little worried, honestly." He bounced around for a while after his last thing didn't pan out. "You know how it is with some people. They need time to find the right fit." He paused. "It's good to see he's got a foot in somewhere." The words landed in the lobby the way heavy things land. Not with drama, but with weight. Garrett's expression did not change. Not a flicker. Not a blink. Not the small involuntary shift of eyebrows that people manage when they're trying not to react. His face simply remained what it was, attentive, composed, completely in possession of itself. He turned to me and said, "Shall we head up? The team's ready when you are." "Ready," I said. As we moved toward the elevator, Garrett paused and looked back at Marcus with the kind of measured civility that comes from decades of managing complex situations without creating additional ones. "We appreciate your brother's work," he said simply. No elaboration. No explanation. Just the sentence, placed in the lobby like a document on a table. And then the elevator doors closed. Inside the elevator, Garrett didn't say anything about what had just happened. He asked about my flight in, whether I'd had a chance to review the revised term sheet, and whether I wanted anything from the conference room before we started. I said no to all 3. He looked straight ahead at the floor numbers changing above the doors and said, "Families are complicated." I said, "They are." The doors opened on 14. The meeting lasted 4 hours. The conference room on the 14th floor had the kind of view that made Columbus look larger than it felt from street level. I sat at the far end of a long table opposite Garrett and 3 members of his acquisitions team, including his general counsel, a woman named Patricia Howe who had a reputation for identifying contract language that looked standard until it wasn't, and his director of product integration, a younger man named Cole who had built 2 tools himself before joining Hollowell and who asked the kind of questions that told you he'd actually used the product. We spent the first hour on structure. The second on what happened to the 41 people who came with the acquisition. That was the part that mattered most to me, and I said so directly, which seemed to register with Garrett in a way that made the rest of the conversation easier. He said he'd never understood founders who negotiated hard on valuation and soft on people. I said I hadn't understood that either. The third hour was about the product roadmap and what integrating Table Lane into Hollowell's existing tech stack would require. Cole had done his homework. He'd built a detailed compatibility map that was mostly right and wrong in the places where being right required actually talking to restaurants, which he hadn't done yet. I corrected him on 4 points and agreed with him on 11. He took notes without ego, which I found reassuring. The fourth hour was mostly legal review with Patricia interjecting every 20 minutes with a question that sounded procedural, but was actually testing whether my answers were consistent. They were, because they were also true, and true answers have a coherence that doesn't require maintenance. By the end of it, we had the framework for a full acquisition agreement that preserved the operational independence of Table Lane, protected the employment of my 41 people, and included a transition advisory role for me that would last 18 months. The number attached to the transaction was one I am not permitted to disclose by the terms of the agreement, but I will say that it was the kind of number that changes the weight of silence retroactively. Every year I spent not explaining myself to people who weren't asking honest questions became, in hindsight, exactly the right call. Garrett's general counsel said she'd have a clean draft ready by Friday. Garrett shook my hand at the door and said it had been a pleasure getting to know how I thought. I told him the same, and I meant it. I took the elevator down. Marcus was still in the lobby. I don't know what he was doing there. Maybe he had a meeting that had been pushed back. Maybe he had stayed because he was trying to make sense of what he'd seen and needed to resolve the confusion before he could move forward with his day. Maybe there's a version where he was just getting a second coffee from the kiosk near the entrance. Whatever the reason, he was sitting in one of the low chairs near the doors, coffee in hand, looking at his phone with the particular unfocused attention of someone who isn't reading, just waiting. He stood when he saw me come off the elevator. "Danny." He said it carefully, the way you say someone's name when you know you've done something but aren't yet sure how much they noticed. I stopped. "Who is Garrett Hollowell?" he asked, CEO of Hollowell Hospitality. Marcus blinked. "The hotel group. Restaurant division primarily. But yes, 14,000 points of operation across North America. They manage everything from boutique dining programs to mid-scale chain infrastructure." He processed this. You could see him doing it, a kind of slow internal inventory where every piece of information I was offering had to be placed against the existing structure before he could respond. "Why does he know you?" I thought about how to answer that, not because I was trying to be difficult. Because there were years inside the answer, and I had to decide how much of the architecture to show. "Table Lane," I said. He stared at me. "Your app. Software platform, 2,000 plus restaurant clients across 11 states, 41 employees. We've been negotiating an acquisition for 5 months." The lobby was quiet. The woman at reception had her eyes on her screen, but her posture said she was listening. The man near security had stopped pretending to look at his phone. Marcus's face did something I hadn't seen it do before. It didn't go red. It didn't go blank. It went very, very still, the way a room goes still when everyone understands at the same moment that the conversation has shifted and there is no comfortable direction left to move in. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He said it was a reasonable question, probably the most reasonable thing he'd said to me in years. "Because the people who needed to know knew," I said. "My team, my investors, my legal counsel, the people I was building something with. We're your family." You told his boss I was probably homeless, Marcus. The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that has texture. Not empty, full of the words that had been said across years of Sunday dinners and phone calls and birthday texts and polite concern that was never quite honest enough to be real concern. "I didn't say homeless," he said. Bounced around, never really landed. Between things, couldn't figure out his direction. I said the phrases without heat, just volume. Just the words themselves given back to him in their actual form, stripped of the sympathetic framing he'd wrapped them in when they were useful to him. I know because Reggie told me what you said at the birthday party in March. I know because the way Garrett looked at you in that lobby was the look of a man who had just heard someone summarize another person inaccurately in real time. He looked at the floor. I'm not trying to embarrass you, I said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not standing here to make you feel small in this lobby the way I felt small at dinner tables for 20 years. I'm trying to explain why I stopped calling home as often. It wasn't because I was struggling. It was because every conversation felt like I was being measured against a story you'd already decided was true. And I didn't have the energy to keep correcting a story nobody was willing to examine. He sat back down, not dramatically, just because standing felt like it required more confidence than he currently had access to. How long? He said. His voice was quieter now, not defensive, just smaller. Table lane, about 6 years. And before that, other things, restaurant work, a collaboration that didn't go anywhere. But the years I spent failing were still mine. They weren't the cautionary tale you needed them to be. He looked up at me then, not defensive anymore, something closer to honest. Dad always said you didn't have direction, he said. Dad was wrong. Another silence. The lobby had mostly emptied around us, which was either coincidental or the result of people with professional instincts removing themselves from a conversation that had become too personal for the setting. I was repeating what he said, Marcus offered. Not to hurt you. I thought I was, he stopped, because whatever sentence he was building had run into a wall he hadn't seen. Protecting me from embarrassment by announcing it for me. He didn't have an answer for that. I didn't go to Marcus's office. I didn't call my parents from the parking lot. I drove to a quiet place near the river I remembered from childhood, a small park with benches facing east, where my father used to take us on Saturday mornings before he decided Saturdays were better used for things that produced outcomes. I sat there for an hour. The river was the Scioto, not dramatic water, not the kind of river that shows up in poems. Just wide and slow and moving in the way that water moves when it doesn't need to impress anyone, which I had always found useful to look at. I thought about the version of this story where I had corrected the record sooner. Where I had called Marcus on the Tuesday, he offered me an administrative job and said, "Actually, let me tell you what's happening." Where I had stopped protecting him from the embarrassment of being wrong about me and let him face the discomfort of revision earlier, before it needed an audience. Before it needed Garrett Hollowell's lobby and 2 witnesses and the particular sound of the elevator closing while Marcus stood watching. I wasn't sure that version would have ended better. Some people revise only when revision is the only option left. Marcus had needed the lobby. He had needed the Mr. Carr and the firm handshake and the 4 seconds of eye contact between Garrett and me before either of us acknowledged he was standing there. He had needed the elevator closing before he could hear any of what I said afterward. Not because he was a bad person, because the story he carried about me was load-bearing. It held up something he needed about himself, some arrangement where his legible success and my invisible absence existed in a particular relationship to each other, and load-bearing stories don't fall without a reason. I had simply been unavailable for years to provide a reason. I also thought about my father, about the word direction and what it costs to be told repeatedly that you don't have it by someone who defines it narrowly enough to never be wrong. My father was not a cruel man. He was a precise one. He had a definition for everything, and anything that didn't fit the definition became evidence of a problem rather than evidence that the definition was incomplete. I had spent years being evidence of a problem. I didn't resent him for it anymore. But I had stopped needing his definitions a long time ago, and the work of building something without anyone's map had taught me that direction was not a visible thing. It was a felt one. My phone rang. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. I answered. "Daniel," she said, "your brother called." "I know. He said you had a meeting with someone very important this morning." "I did." "He said he might have," she paused. I heard the particular sound of a parent searching for language that preserves everyone's dignity while also conveying the necessary information. He might have said some things that weren't entirely accurate about your situation. He did. He feels terrible. I looked at the river. He doesn't need to feel terrible, I said. He needs to understand the difference between what he observed and what was true. Those are different problems, and only one of them is about me. She was quiet. My mother's silence was a different thing from Marcus's silence. Marcus's silence contained calculation. My mother's contained regret. I'm not cutting Marcus off, I said. I'm not angry, but I'm also not going to keep making it easy to be invisible just because being visible is uncomfortable for everyone else. What does that mean? She asked. It means I'll be at Thanksgiving, I said, but I'm not going to sit through a conversation about how I should have figured things out sooner. I figured things out. They just weren't being announced. She said she'd talk to him. I said all right. Then she said something that surprised me. She said, I should have asked more questions. Just that, no defense, no history, no pivot to what Marcus had really meant or what my father would have said or what the family had been through in the years I'd been away. Just a sentence that admitted something small enough to be real. I said, yeah, but we can start now. She made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement, the sound of a person receiving something they're not sure they've earned. That's enough for now, I said. I'll call you Sunday. The acquisition closed 6 weeks later. I won't describe the signing ceremony, except to say that 41 people whose livelihoods had been connected to a product I built in a one-bedroom apartment in Seattle were now protected by an agreement with a company that had the infrastructure to take that product further than I could have taken it alone. There was paperwork. There were signatures. Patricia Howe reviewed every clause with the expression of someone who has been disappointed by careless language before and has no intention of being disappointed again. Cole asked 2 last-minute questions, both of which were good. Garrett signed last, and when he did, he looked up at me once before he put the pen down. That mattered more than any dollar amount. That's not sentiment. That's just the truth. Garrett hosted a small dinner the night after closing at a restaurant we'd visited early in the negotiation process. It was a mid-size Italian place near downtown, not flashy, the kind of restaurant that had been excellent for 30 years and didn't feel the need to announce it. He said he liked to end things where they started. I said I thought that was a good habit. We talked about the product's first year inside Hollowell's infrastructure, about what the integration would require, about which of my team members had the strongest institutional knowledge and needed to be protected from the reorganization instinct that large companies sometimes couldn't resist. He took notes. A CEO who took notes at dinner was rarer than you'd hope. Then he asked how things were with my brother. I said we were working on it. He nodded like that was a complete answer, which maybe it was. There's a particular kind of person, he said, pushing a piece of bread into a small pool of olive oil on his plate, who does the work quietly and waits to see who notices. It's a useful trait if the waiting doesn't last forever. I said sometimes the waiting goes longer than intended. He said he'd noticed. Then he said he'd also noticed, in 5 months of conversation, that I never once used the words I deserve as a negotiating point. He said most founders had it somewhere in their pitch, hidden under confidence or dressed up as vision, the implication that the ask was merited because of effort or difficulty or time invested. He said that was usually the moment he started worrying, because deserve was backward-looking and acquisition was forward-looking, and people who needed credit for the past sometimes forgot to build anything for the future. I said I'd had the same thought but would have expressed it differently. He laughed. I thought about Marcus in the lobby. The confident summary of a life he didn't know. The comfortable authority of someone explaining a weather pattern to a meteorologist. Then I thought about what it would mean to have spent those 6 years needing him to know, needing him to acknowledge it, checking in every few months to see if his perception had shifted, measuring my progress against his belief in my failure. The relief of not having done that was enormous and quiet and felt, sitting in that restaurant, almost like the whole point. Marcus called me 2 weeks after the closing. He didn't lead with an apology, which I respected more than if he had. Apologies that lead are sometimes just better packaged versions of the same performance. He led with a question. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Did you ever want me to know, before all this? I thought about it honestly. It took longer than a quick answer would have allowed. Parts of me did, I said. The part that still wanted you to think better of me than you did. The part that grew up at the dinner table where your trophies had their own shelf and my projects were things I worked on after everyone else went to bed. That part wanted credit. And the other part knew you'd make it about something other than what it was. Not because you're a bad person. Because you needed a story about me that made sense alongside the one you had about yourself. The brother who figured it out and the brother who didn't. The one who announced his success and the one who was quietly talked about in parking lots at parties. A long pause. That's probably true, he said. I know it is. Another pause, longer this time. I told Hollowell you were probably homeless, he said. You told him I hadn't figured out my direction. Same thing in that lobby. Yeah, I agreed, pretty much. I'm sorry, Daniel. He said it the way people say something when they've finally accepted that the sentence is necessary and the reasons for avoiding it have all run out. Not performed, not strategic, just said. I know, I told him. Is that enough? I thought about all the ways I could answer that question. The years of Sunday dinners I had reduced myself through. The phone calls where I'd accepted the smaller version of myself because correcting it required energy I was spending elsewhere. The cousin who'd called me in March with second-hand humiliation and the half-amused laugh of someone who saw it coming. It's a start, I said. That's different from enough, but it's a real start. He exhaled. Something in it sounded like the release of a structure that had been under pressure for a long time. I can work with that, he said. Good, so can I. The Thanksgiving I'd promised came in November. I drove rather than flew, wanting the time in the car to adjust to the idea of being in that house again with the current version of myself instead of the version they'd kept on file. My father hugged me at the door. He held on slightly longer than his usual handshake converted to hug, which was his version of saying something he didn't have language for. My mother made the same meal she always made, which was her version of continuity, the argument that love could be expressed through repetition if the repetition was careful enough. Marcus was already there when I arrived. He shook my hand, which was different from the hug he gave me at holidays when we were teenagers. It was formal and real at the same time, the handshake of someone who had recalibrated the relationship and wasn't sure what the new register called for. My father asked about the acquisition at dinner. Not to be impressive, not to show off what he'd read about, but because he genuinely wanted to understand something he hadn't understood before. He asked what a restaurant software platform actually did, how it worked, who used it. He listened without offering opinions. That was new. At one point he said, I didn't know you were interested in restaurants. I thought that was just the job in Portland. I said, the job in Portland was how I found the problem. The problem was the interesting part. He considered that. I suppose that's a different way of doing it. I said it was. He nodded slowly, like someone accepting a correction from a map that turned out to be more accurate than the one they'd been using. Marcus told a story at dinner about a client presentation that had gone wrong in a way that turned out to be instructive. He told it on himself, which was not something I had heard him do before. My mother laughed in a way that suggested the evening was going better than she'd expected it to. After dinner, Marcus and I sat on the porch while my parents cleaned up inside. It was cold in the specific November way of the Midwest, not brutal yet but direct, the air saying winter without yelling it. He said, Phil asked about you. Phil was the colleague from the birthday party. The one who had said, that's rough, man, in the tone of gracious sympathy. What did you tell him? I asked. Marcus smiled just slightly. I told him my brother ran a company that Hollowell acquired. He looked at me like I was making it up. What did you say? I said, yeah, I know. The porch was quiet. A neighbor's porch light flickered on across the street. "You could have taken credit," I said. "Told him you knew all along." "I thought about it," Marcus said, "for about 3 seconds. A pause. It felt like the wrong direction." I looked at him. "That's growth," I said. He said, "Don't push it." We sat there for a while longer without talking, which was something we hadn't been able to do in a long time, be in the same space without the silence requiring management. The last thing I'll tell you is this. The lobby story got around. Not because I told it. Because Garrett Hollowell was a man who had spent a career in hospitality, which means he understood that how you treat people before you know who they are is the only honest data point. He mentioned the encounter at an industry dinner 3 months later, not to embarrass anyone, but because he was giving a talk on the difference between operational intelligence and social performance, which was a distinction he believed most organizations confused. He didn't use my name. He didn't use Marcus's name. He described a lobby. He described a paper coffee cup. He described a family member explaining another person to a room that already knew the full picture. He said the lesson wasn't about the person being explained. It was about the moment of explanation itself, the casual authority with which people reduce others when they believe no one with relevant information is listening. He said, "The most dangerous thing about underestimating someone is that they usually already know you're doing it. They're just deciding whether it's worth correcting you." Then he said something else that I heard about secondhand and have thought about many times since. He said the founder in the story had spent 6 years building something without seeking permission or acknowledgement from people who had the wrong impression. He said that was not stubbornness or reclusiveness or the inability to maintain relationships. It was the practical understanding that some corrections require more energy than the relationship is currently worth, and that the most efficient use of that energy is to simply continue building until the correction happens on its own. He said, "I've been in dozens of rooms where someone was being talked about who was better positioned than the speaker knew. In every single case, the person being talked about was aware. They were just choosing their moment." Someone in the audience asked what happened to the person in the story. Garrett said the deal closed. The audience laughed. He let them laugh, then said, "It's not funny. It's a warning. Because the next person someone writes off in a lobby might not have the patience to wait until the elevator closes." I heard about this from someone on my new team who had been at the dinner and recognized the shape of the story without knowing it was mine. She sent me a text that said, "I think I know who the founder in Garrett's talk was." I sent her back 3 words, "Don't tell anyone." She sent back a thumbs up. That was the right answer. There's one more thing I want to say, because I've been thinking about it since Thanksgiving, sitting on that porch with Marcus while the November cold made its case for going back inside. For a long time, I told myself my silence was strategic, that I was protecting something. That letting people believe the wrong thing about me was a considered choice with a specific endpoint, and that when the endpoint arrived, the record would correct itself naturally and efficiently. That was partially true, but it was also partially avoidance. Avoidance of the particular discomfort of being seen incorrectly by people you once wanted to impress and having to decide whether the relationship was worth the energy of the correction. Avoidance of the conversation with my father that would have required me to say directly, "Your definition of direction is wrong, and I am evidence of that, and I need you to reconsider it." Avoidance of the call to Marcus where I told him clearly what I was building, which would have required me to be vulnerable before I had the protection of having already succeeded. The lobby removed the need for that vulnerability. That was the relief I felt in the elevator with Garrett. Not triumph. Relief. The relief of having the room arrive at the truth without me having to argue for it. But relief is not the same as healing. And healing requires something that lobbies can't provide. After Thanksgiving, I called my father on a Sunday, not because my mother asked me to, but because I decided to. I told him about Table Lane from the beginning, about Portland and Gloria and the water filtration project I built at 12 that never made it to the refrigerator. About the years I spent working without updating anyone because updating felt like applying for permission I didn't need. He listened for almost an hour. He did not interrupt. At the end, he asked one question. Were you afraid I wouldn't think it was enough? I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I gave you that fear, didn't I? It wasn't a question, and it wasn't dressed up as anything else. No defense, no revision, just a man accepting a true thing about himself that was uncomfortable and had consequences. Yeah, I said, you did. I'm sorry for that, he said. That was the apology that mattered more than any lobby, more than any deal, more than Garrett Hollowell's dinner talk or the way Marcus's face had changed in the elevator's absence. It was the apology that came from someone actually looking at what they'd done and naming it plainly, without the protection of context or intention or the suggestion that I had misunderstood. I said, I know, I'm calling you on Sundays now. He said, I'll answer. I drove back to Seattle in early December. The mountains appeared on the approach into the city the way they always do, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with you, which I find useful. Some things do not require your presence to be what they are. I went to the diner 3 blocks from my apartment, the same table, the same order, the same street outside. Nothing about the morning looked like a victory from the outside. That, more than anything, was the part I wanted to keep. Because the version of this story where I come home different, announced, visibly transformed, where people who underestimated me now sit at tables and marvel at what I became while they weren't watching, that version is satisfying to imagine. But it's not the real story. The real story is that I built something quietly, waited longer than I should have for reasons that were not entirely clean, and eventually the truth arrived in a lobby because buildings don't know who you're supposed to be, only who you are. And the lobby did the work that years of argument couldn't have done, not because the work was about proving something to Marcus or my father or anyone else who had filed me in the wrong place, but because the work was about something else entirely. About Gloria and the 41 people and the 2,000 restaurants, and the thing I had promised myself in a 1-bedroom apartment in Seattle when I was 27 years old and had nothing visible to show for 3 years of effort except a product that was almost right. Almost right became right. Right became real. Real became the room and the handshake and the 2 words, Mr. Carr. That's the whole story. Everything else is just the lobby. So I'll ask you this. If the people who underestimated you finally had to face what you actually built while they weren't paying attention, would you want them to see it all at once? Or would you let the lobby do the work for you? Tell me in the comments. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for yourself is simply keep building until the room catches up.